We continue our introduction to critical thinking by laying some further groundwork for the real meat of our study. So as a reminder, the material that we're covering in this video is material from Chapter 1, and in a lot of ways, Chapter 1 of our text is a sort of backdrop for the heart of the concepts we're going to study and the skills we're going to develop. So as you probably already noticed with the first video from Chapter 1, I'm taking a real cursory look at some material. Right, so don't feel like if it feels superficial, don't feel like you're missing something. It is pretty superficial. I'm working to make sure that we get that we're not overwhelmed by concepts that we're going to be looking at in more detail later. In addition, I kind of want to set the stage, if you will, for the real meat of our work. So, partly to that end was the discussion of sentences, definitions, and meaning. And here it's going to be an introduction to some concepts and skills that we are going to want to understand, but also use. And we'll find that there's a bit of overlap. What I mean by that is, for example, the discussion of exposition and argument involves analysis, and the activity of expositing, and the activity of arguing or reading or hearing arguments involves analysis. All right, so let's start with exposition. When we are confronted by or presented with an argument, we're going to not simply jump to whether or not we like the thing. Instead, we are going to do some exposition work. In other words, we're going to describe and explain what it is that we are experiencing, what it is that we're reading, hearing, or sometimes even seeing. So, for example, when you read a story or you watch a TV show or you watch a YouTube video or you see a movie, you don't always only say, oh, it was good or bad. You will oftentimes describe what it is that's going on. So take, for example, just expositing a story, you are going to talk about the events, right? You're going to talk about plot. This happened, this happened, this happened. You might explain a bit about that plot. Characters say and do something and explain the context in which it takes place, and so forth. So the point is, when you exposit, you're involved in trying to be as objective as possible. You might think a little bit about exposition as trying to simply report on what's going on rather than provide any kind of evaluation. Analysis is also going to involve, as much as possible, objectivity. I say as much as possible because, as we'll see, analysis involve rules, and rules sometimes can be reflective of certain attitudes or beliefs that we have. And so in that sense, there may be not quite so much as objectivity as we would like. In any event, that's another discussion. For now, let's say that analysis is the foundation of critical thinking, and by that I mean analysis involves the careful and methodical examination of sifting out of elements in an argument. So we are going to separate out, for the purpose of further examination, the sentences involved in an argument, the concepts involved in those sentences, so that we're better able to understand what it is that the argument is after, and we're better able to make an evaluation that is compelling, and an evaluation that is, by objective standards, um, successful. In other words, what we don't want to do is simply accept or reject an argument without being able to refer to some standards that reasonable people can agree are good standards. So that's partly what I mean when I say that analysis directly or indirectly involves rules. Think, for example, about what happens when you're confronted by loads and loads of information. You need to, and you do, sift through that information, right? How do you go about sifting through that information? Or think about, forget your own particular experience, think about how, for example, an algorithm is programmed to sift through data for relevance, right? So how about this? Think about how, let's say, there are blood tests that are designed for to detect specific things in the blood, right? Not everything is examined in a blood test. Very precise measurements are required for a specific sort of blood test. And we're looking for one thing, not some other. So, for example, we're looking for antibodies. We're not looking for certain things in, the plasma, right? Or think, for example, about how you, let's say you run around the internet and you notice that there are certain ads that keep popping up. They seem to follow you, right? Whatever website you go to. There are algorithms that are created in order to, and I know I'm sort of fudging here a little bit for the purpose of the example, but there are algorithms that are created to detect where you've been on the internet, and if it's a matter of marketing, to market certain products or websites to you as you go to this, that, and the other website on the internet. So, analysis is a crucial part of what we're going to be involved in doing in critical thinking. And in one sense, analysis does not at all involve bias or values or belief systems, right? In other words, you and I are going to think as objectively as possible when we're involved in analysis. But in some other sense, it's going to be the case that we are restricting ourselves, right? We're analyzing within a conceptual framework or a rules-based framework in order to do our work. And so in that sense, there is some bias involved. But that doesn't have to be something that means that the study or the analysis is just relative, right? Anything goes. That's not the case. It's just that we are discriminating for the purpose of our study, just as a blood test has to sort of discriminate in order to get at what it is that the researcher is looking for. Okay, lastly, you probably are already familiar with this if you've gone through the overview video that I created for us, the overview of the course, right, where I talk about the goal of the critical thinking course, but also the previous video in which some of the framework for our study of reasoning is covered. So you already know a little bit about what an argument is. That's okay. It's okay, rather, that we're saying something about this again. Why? Because this is the core of our study, right? Studying argumentation, how argument succeeds, how argument fails. So repetition is not a bad thing here. So let's move on to talk about what an argument is. It's a collection of statements, one of which is supported by the other or others. The collection of statements or a particular sort of sentence, right, that is a sentence that is true or false, is broken down into the supporting and the supported statements. So the supporting statements are used to provide evidence or reasons to believe the truth of the supported statement. The evidence or reasons in an argument are called premises. Premises imply that the conclusion or the supported statement is true. The supported statement is the conclusion, which is inferred from the premises. So notice the technical language that we're already starting to develop. We've been using it without really highlighting it so much. When we move on to get more technical, that is when we really start our deep dive into argument in chapter 2 of our text, we are going to make sure that we're comfortable with the technical language that we're going to be using throughout the semester. So an example will help us remember what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about an argument, and this is an example that I've used before, right? Great cheese comes from happy cows come from California, ellipsis. These two sentences, great cheese comes from happy cows come from California, are the evidence for the conclusion. These sentences are the premises. These sentences provide reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. These sentences imply what? The sentence, great cheese comes from California. Right? So an argument is a very specific array of sentences. That is, sentences that bear an inferential relation to another sentence. More precisely, the sentences great cheese, again, to reiterate, great cheese comes from happy cows come from California, imply the sentence great cheese comes from California, or the sentence great cheese comes from California is inferred from the sentence great cheese comes from happy cows come from California. Let me offer you, by way of what I'm going to call kid logic, a way of enlisting the concepts that we've just discussed. Example number 1. Upon losing her first tooth, a child's dad tells her that the tooth fairy will leave a quarter on her pillow, or under her pillow, provided that she leaves her tooth under her pillow. That night, while fast asleep, the child's father tiptoes into his daughter's room, whereby he removes her tooth. As he slips a quarter into its place, the child awakens and says sleepily, "Daddy, why didn't you tell me you're the tooth fairy?" Second example. A parent says, "The baby is in the mommy's tummy." The child says in response, "Did mommy eat the baby?" Example 3. Daddy has to read mommy's book. Why? The child responds, "Daddy's not a lady." Example 4. A child says during a baby shower, "Why isn't anyone taking a shower?" Notice what's going on here. So first, let's exposit each of these examples. Then let's analyze it in terms of what's going on for the child. And then let's see if we can understand the inference that the child is making. So first off, when we exposit the examples, we're trying to explain what's going on from a child's perspective, right? So we know what the one tradition is that some parents follow when a child has lost its baby tooth or its baby teeth, if multiple teeth have come out, right? There's a tradition in which children are told that the tooth fairy will effectively buy the child's teeth or the child's tooth, and the purchase goes like this: the child has to leave the tooth under the pillow, whereupon some remuneration is placed under the pillow in its place. More in exposition. In this case, the child wakes up during the exchange, and the child infers, based on the context of the tooth fairy story, that the parent is the tooth fairy. Okay, next example, exposition. A parent is told that the mother is pregnant, and since the child is maybe too young to understand what pregnancy means, right? The child isn't going to understand things like a uterus and so forth. The child is told that the baby is in the mommy's tummy, right? Let's suppose that the woman's pregnancy is at a stage where the stomach is expanding, and so the shorthand is that the child is told the baby is in the mommy's tummy. That's the explanation offered. And the child infers from that the baby has been eaten by the mother. Suppose that the next scenario, right? Daddy has to read mommy's book, right? Suppose that there are two people. There's a woman who's the mommy and a man who's the daddy, and the child is told, so the offspring is told that daddy's got to read a book that mommy has been reading. And so the possessive is used, it's mommy's book, and the child infers on the basis of the book belonging to mommy that it's a book that is for mommies. Lastly, a child is at a baby shower. The child doesn't understand the concept of a baby shower and doesn't understand why it is that people are not in a shower. So there's a bit of exposition. Analysis. Well, we can say that from the supposition of what is involved in certain concepts, a child makes inferences that we would think are erroneous, that we would think are errors. We can, however, explain the error according to how a child takes certain concepts literally, right? So a child might believe in the tooth fairy and then makes the connection between the concept of a tooth fairy and the concept of, in this case, the father leaving a quarter, right? The child takes literally the idea of being in a stomach, and perfectly, in some sense, legitimately, the idea that the mommy eats the baby, right? Because the kid is used to having things in one's stomach being a matter of eating. Again, the child is not expected to understand. The child has not been told that it's not literally the case that the fetus is in the stomach because the fetus is in the uterus. precisely because the child is not expected to understand the concept, let's say, of a uterus and the concept of gestation, and so forth, right? But notice that in each of these cases, a child is, on the basis of what the child is told, on the basis of concepts the child has had explained to him or her, or on the basis of concepts that the child understands at this point, that draws some inference, right? So uh, we, you, I, small children, are in the business, if you will, of drawing inferences. So one of the things that we want to think about as we're looking at kid logic is what it is that we take to be going on in the reasoning, right? So how can we explain what's happening? How is it that we can separate out the parts of the argument, right? So what is it that is being presented as evidence? What is it that, in this case, the child is inferring? And then we can also come back once we've done that work to try to be charitable to the child's inference, but also try to show how the reasoning doesn't go well. And then what we want to be able to do is take that process and use it in our own experience with reasoning, right? When we're confronted by an argument, how can we uh, uh, describe what's going on, explain the elements, and then also articulate what it is that's gone well in the reasoning and what it is that's maybe not gone well in the reasoning, if that's relevant. I hope this cursory overview of exposition, analysis, and argument helps you orient your thinking. Remember, this video, the previous video, is individually and collectively are meant to provide you with some touchstones for thinking, some orientation for thinking as we move into the real meat of our course.